This presentation will examine historical and comparative research methods. When we say historical research, we mean that generally we're going to be comparing something across time. And when we say comparative research, we mean generally we're going to be comparing something across space. And when we combine the two, we are comparing units across space and time. And as such, it's less of a new type of method as it is a kind of organizing logic. And we'll look into some of the methods used. In fact, it can be quantitative, it can be qualitative. So we can be looking at statistics, or we can be looking at usually historical archival documents, something like that. And as a result, it could be nomothetic, which is usually the case with statistical research, or idiographic, which is more common in qualitative research. It could be inductive or deductive, which means inductive research is exploratory, more typical of qualitative, and deductive is more hypothesis testing and quantitative typically. And as well, it could be variable or case-oriented. And so we see a kind of commonality running through the kind of qualitative style that tends to be idiographic, inductive, and case-oriented, or quantitative, nomothetic, deductive, and variable-oriented. And the quantitative tends to rely on secondary data, while the qualitative tends to rely on documents and historical archival research. And generally what we see when we do historical research is that it tends to be case-oriented, and that case could be an event such as maybe a war or some other kind of defining event, maybe a famine, something like that. Or it could be a place. Cases could be nations, they could be communities, or they could be entities such as an organization. And historical methods are typically more holistic and more qualitative and inductive, and it pays a lot of attention to context and process, whereas more quantitative methods tend to overlook those things. Historical methods tend to be conjunctural, and that means we have multiple simultaneous causes at work, and it's really the best method for peeling apart really complex events, and so it has a very unique purpose in research. And of course it's temporal, so we're looking at how events fold over time. Generally, when we do historical methods, we're using historical specificity, we're not looking to generalize our results beyond the particular cases or case that we're studying. We are really going to look at the specific context, the specific time, the specific circumstances related to our case. And when a historical analysis is underway, generally this takes the form of a narrative account. And that means essentially, if you're the historical researcher, you're trying to put together a story. And that story will be typically a sequence of events, some of which happen in a linear fashion, some of which happen in a cyclical fashion, and as we mentioned, some of which happen simultaneously. So this is really quite a task, taking on the construction of a historical narrative. And it's important to note here that the researcher, as a result, has a lot of power in the analysis because they're the ones building the story. And ideally and hopefully they're using evidence and facts to help put that storyline together. The challenges with historical research methods have to do with lost documents, particularly if you're doing archival research. Let's say you're looking at old newspapers. Well, it's possible that maybe a couple issues are just missing, and that can put some holes in your timeline. So that actually creates a bit of sample bias, especially if there's any kind of systematic missing data. Not usually the case here, but it could be. And it's very difficult to try to understand, looking backwards, as another drawback of historical methods, anything subjective. We're not able to conduct surveys of people who've been dead for hundreds of years, for instance, so it raises some new and unique challenges. Historical events research is a cross-sectional approach. Essentially, we can use event structure analysis, and that involves the coding of key events or characteristics to build the timeline. We'll look at an example of that in just a moment. And the resulting chronological structure is used to assemble the narrative explanation, which is usually in a causal kind of manner, causal sequence. A good metaphor for that, if you've ever watched old crime shows, or actually new crime shows, often use these kinds of things. The scenes where they have the bulletin board with the pins and the strings. What they're trying to do in that particular scenario is use an event structure analysis to understand a crime. And of course, we're not just limited to studying crimes with this type of method, and we don't have to use the same kind of props as those television shows. We can use computer programs and that type of thing, but the general idea is there. We can also use oral histories, which is sort of like an in-depth interview with someone, but without any purpose necessarily. I mean, usually when we do in-depth interviews, we're trying to find a particular thing out about them, but with oral histories, it's just more of a broad, open-ended discussion, and they get to share their views on things, and their interviews become a source of data for researchers in the future who can then come back and listen to those and code them and take notes, and that helps make up for this drawback of being unable to go back in time to assess subjective feelings. So here is an example of an event structure analysis. This is taken out of the Russell Shute textbook, and you can see this is just lined up in sort of a linear fashion. This particular structure analysis is not too complicated. There's only a couple of simultaneous things happening. Most of it is rather linear, which makes it a little more easy to understand conceptually and also to piece together. So historical process research, as opposed to event research, tends to be more longitudinal. And this can be either quantitative or qualitative, variable or case-oriented, deductive or inductive as a result. And usually when we're doing this kind of thing, it tends to be also comparative. And so the example there is Frank et al.'s comparison of nations over time, looking at their environmental protection measures and showing how those evolve across time, but also using a rather large sample, using many nations, with somewhat less information about each individual case. Right? So it's a different kind of thing. We're going across time, and we're going into less depth. There has to be some sacrifice. If we're going into depth, we usually can't have too much breadth, and alternatively, if we have a lot of breadth, we can't have too much depth. That trade-off tends to hold. Comparative methods involve the comparison of at least two or more cases. Sometimes a case study of one is really an implicit case study, meaning we're comparing it to more generalized cases that are already known. This can be cross-sectional, and that means we're extending our understanding across space rather than across time. Beyond single units, if we're looking at nations, usually we're looking at several. Comparative research is more likely to be quantitative than historical research, but it can be qualitative. Quantitative data is generally available publicly, and analysis that's based on that tends to be deductive and nomothetic. The first example of that is Durkheim's suicide study, where he looked at rates of suicide by country and compared that to the types of religions in those countries. Qualitative data, there's less readily available secondary sources, and an exception to that is the human relations area file, but generally that's less common. Comparative historical research, of course, takes the two. We're going to include history in our comparative analysis. Important for identifying the role of context on causal explanations. That's an important thing. We don't want to Of course, a lot of times social researchers want to generalize, but when we're incorporating history, we're kind of giving up that goal in order to gain a greater understanding of the specific context, which is also worthwhile. So a good example of that is Weber's that classic explanation of how capitalism came to be, the Protestant work ethic, right? That one. And of course, the challenge here is that internal causes, or what appear to be internally motivated causes, could be actually triggered by something external. So we don't want to assume cases exist independently of one another. Comparative case study designs involve the identification and selection of cases based on some level of similarity or difference. There was a method developed by John Stuart Mills involving the method of agreement or difference, and so the cases, rather than just kind of haphazardly selected, are chosen on specific features or characteristics. And a good application of that, a good example, is Theda Scotch-Paul's analysis of social revolutions. And that was a very in-depth comparative historical analysis. And what this involves typically is finding positive and negative case comparisons. So if I'm studying revolutions, I want to find cases where the revolutions did occur and where they did not, and try to explain both why they did and why they did not, why they failed to happen. The field of demography is a quantitative field for the most part, involving the analysis of population and all of its features, all of its characteristics, such as size, composition, and distribution, and is entirely comparative and often is historical as well, but a quantitative form of historical comparative. So we're not going into too much depth, we're not looking too much at context, and a lot of times there are attempts to generalize. So when we study demography, we're looking primarily at this equation down here, population change as a result of births minus deaths plus net migration. And this simple equation, of course, has a number of causes and outcomes that are of interest to demographers. And there's a lot of research to be done there. So population composition is another thing of interest, not just the size, density, or distribution. Also the selection of characteristics such as age, race, and sex are important. And the census is a good source of that type of data, or as we try to compare countries, each relative census becomes valuable. Demographers are known for making these population pyramids, which are generally at the national level or regional level, or maybe transnational level even, comparing levels of age distribution. So how many people exist in this particular geographic space by age interval. And so you can see in the developing world, for instance, we have this pyramid shape, meaning there are fewer old people, more young people. And in the more developed world, you have a bulge that's sort of in the middle. You have more people of working age. You do have more older people, but you have less younger people. So demographic analysis is comparative and historical research that involves a focus on population, giving it that demographic component. And course studies are generally, as I said, comparative, quantitative, and nomothetic. That is, they generally start with some kind of theoretical expectations or hypotheses that are going to be tested, and there are theories of demography and demographic change, such as all the various transitions that are theorized. And demographic research is heavily reliant on secondary data sources, primarily, as I mentioned, from different census data that are collected. So since a lot of historical and comparative research tends to be what we would call unobtrusive, that is, we're not really even coming into contact with real people. We might be studying people who lived hundreds of years ago, circumstances that existed hundreds of years ago, or where we're using secondary data from a census. We never actually come into contact with the people from whom the data were collected, and as a result, there just aren't as many ethical worries with these methods as compared to, say, experiments where you have a lot of contact and you are in fact deceiving or otherwise manipulating people. So from an ethical standpoint, there's a lot less to be worried about. It doesn't mean we should ignore the ethics, and especially when you're revealing the identity of individuals from historical documents. Such individuals could potentially still be around, or their descendants, and so we want to be careful to consider privacy issues. We don't want to bring any kind of harm to the people we're studying or their relatives or descendants. And when it comes to comparative research, for instance, if we do surveys in more than one country, this raises special considerations because we're dealing with multiple cultures. And we have to be aware of what may be normative and acceptable in one country may be offensive and deviant in another, right? So we need to be very aware of cultural differences in terms of the types of research questions we're asking. We don't want to cause any kind of harm. And that essentially wraps it up. That is our discussion of historical and comparative research. Thank you.